A common but unhelpful piece of advice given to perfectionists is to simply care less or let things go. This rarely works, and it isn't hard to see why. Perfectionism was never really about the task itself. It was about avoiding a specific kind of old pain, criticism, disapproval, the sense of not being enough. Telling someone to care less about the outcome doesn't touch the actual fear underneath it, which means the advice tends to produce guilt about still caring, on top of the original anxiety. A more workable starting point is not trying to lower how much you care, but building new, lived evidence that the feared outcome, being criticized, being seen as not good enough, is actually survivable. This is a slower process than simply deciding to care less, but it's a far more durable one because it's addressing the actual mechanism driving the pattern rather than papering over it with a mindset shift that doesn't hold under pressure. One of the most immediately useful tools for perfectionism is simply naming what's happening in the moment it happens. When you notice the urge to reread something for the fifth time, or the flicker of panic at the thought of submitting work that's merely good, pausing to say, even silently, "This is the perfectionism alarm going off," creates a small but meaningful gap between the feeling and the automatic response. This works because perfectionism operates largely on autopilot. The checking, the redoing, the avoiding all happen before there's time to properly evaluate whether they're actually necessary. Naming the pattern out loud, even briefly, engages a different part of the brain, the part capable of noticing a pattern rather than simply being run by it. It doesn't make the urge disappear immediately, but with enough repetition, it starts to create real choice, where previously there was only automatic reaction. Perfectionism thrives on ambiguity about when a task is actually finished, because an undefined finish line can always be pushed a little further. A powerful counter to this is deciding, explicitly and in advance, exactly what done will look like before starting a piece of work. A specific word count, a specific number of revision passes, a specific level of detail, and treating that point as genuinely complete once reached. This feels uncomfortable at first because it requires tolerating the awareness that more could theoretically still be done. But an explicit, pre-decided finish line gives the nervous system something concrete to hold on to, rather than an open-ended standard that can always demand one more pass. Over time, hitting that pre-decided point repeatedly and finding that nothing catastrophic follows becomes some of the most convincing evidence a perfectionist nervous system can receive. Building real tolerance for imperfection generally works best through small, deliberate experiments, rather than a single dramatic shift in mindset. One widely used approach involves picking a low-stakes task and consciously finishing it at around 70% of your usual standard, then paying close attention to what actually happens afterwards. In the overwhelming majority of cases, nothing does. No criticism arrives, no relationship ends, no career is derailed. Repeating this deliberately across low-stakes situations first, before moving to higher-stakes ones, slowly builds a body of genuine, lived evidence that contradicts the alarm's prediction. This is a fundamentally different process to simply being told, "It'll be fine." It's the nervous system learning, through direct and repeated experience, that this category of situation doesn't carry the danger it has been treating it as carrying. This kind of evidence tends to be far more durable than any purely logical reassurance. It helps to choose the first few experiments carefully: a text to a close friend, a rough note to yourself, a household task nobody else will inspect. These are far better starting points than a work presentation or anything with an audience attached, because the goal at this stage is simply proving to yourself that the sky doesn't fall, not testing your nerve under real pressure. Only once the low-stakes version has been repeated enough times to feel genuinely boring does it make sense to try the same experiment somewhere slightly higher stakes. Rushing this order tends to backfire because a difficult experience early on can end up reinforcing the very belief you're trying to unlearn. For many perfectionists, the hardest moment isn't the work itself, but receiving feedback or noticing a mistake after the fact. A useful first step here is separating the size of the mistake from the size of the emotional reaction. Recognizing that a strong internal response doesn't necessarily mean the mistake itself was significant, only that an old alarm has been triggered. Practically, this can look like pausing before responding to criticism, giving the initial wave of shame or panic a few minutes to settle before deciding how to actually act on the feedback. It can also help to deliberately separate the feedback into what's genuinely useful and what's simply painful to hear, since the two aren't always the same thing. None of this requires becoming indifferent to mistakes. It simply means responding to them as information to be used, rather than as evidence of a fundamental flaw to be punished. It's worth being honest about what change actually looks like here, because perfectionism has a tendency to apply its own impossible standard even to the process of healing from it. Progress with perfectionism rarely looks like the feeling disappearing entirely. It looks like the alarm going off less often, being recognized more quickly when it does, and recovering from it faster than before, not the total absence of the urge to check something one more time. Setbacks are a normal, expected part of this process, not proof that it isn't working. A returned old habit during a stressful week doesn't erase the progress made in calmer ones. Most people who work seriously on this notice small shifts within a few weeks, catching the pattern slightly sooner, recovering slightly faster, long before the underlying feeling itself has meaningfully softened. That gap between behavior changing first and feeling changing later is normal, not a sign that something is going wrong. It also helps to expect the process to feel disproportionately hard around anything that matters most to you, since perfectionism was always strongest exactly where the stakes felt highest. A calm week with easy tasks is not a fair test of how far you've come. A stressful week with something genuinely important on the line is. Judge progress over months, not days, and against your own earlier baseline, not against some imagined version of a person who never struggled with this at all. If anything covered this week has resonated, the most useful next step isn't attempting to apply all of it perfectly starting tomorrow. It's picking one small specific practice and letting that be enough for now. Thank you for spending Series 17 with us here on Healing Through Thoughts.